Before we dive into one of the most disturbing stories from the final days of American slavery, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. This channel uncovers the histories they don't teach in schools, the truths buried in forgotten archives. If you're ready for a story that will haunt you long after this video ends, give this video a like right now. Let's begin. Charleston, South Carolina, March 1859. The air hung thick with humidity and something else, something darker that clung to the cobblestone streets of the old city like a stain that wouldn't wash away. In just 2 years, the nation would tear itself apart in civil war, but on this particular morning, the institution of slavery was still legal, still thriving, still destroying lives with the casual brutality of a system that had convinced itself it was civilized. On the corner of Chalmers and State Streets stood Ryan's Mart, one of the largest slave auction houses in the South. The building still stands today, though it's been converted into a museum, a monument to horrors most would prefer to forget. But in March of 1859, it was a place of business, where human beings were bought and sold like livestock, where families were torn apart, where the worst of humanity performed its transactions in broad daylight. The auction that morning drew the usual crowd: plantation owners from across South Carolina and Georgia, speculators looking to turn a profit, overseers sent by wealthy men who couldn't be bothered to attend themselves. Among them was a man named Nathaniel Harlow, owner of Blackwater Plantation, a sprawling rice plantation that stretched along the Ashley River about 20 miles from Charleston. Harlow was 50, 3 years old, a widower, and according to the few surviving photographs, a man whose face showed the weathering of decades spent under the southern sun, but also something else, a hardness around the eyes that suggested he'd seen things, done things that left their mark. What's crucial to understand about Nathaniel Harlow is that he was not new to this. He'd owned enslaved people his entire adult life. He'd inherited Blackwater from his father, who'd inherited it from his father. The Harlow family had been in the business of human suffering for 3 generations. By 1859, Harlow enslaved over 200 people on his plantation. He was not a man prone to sentiment. He was not a man who hesitated. And yet, what happened that morning at Ryan's Mart would haunt him until his death 30 years later. The auction began at 10 o'clock. The first lots were men, strong young men in their 20s and 30s, the kind that plantation owners paid premium prices for. They went quickly, sold to the highest bidders with little fanfare. Then came families, mothers with small children, though everyone in that room knew those families wouldn't stay together long. The cruelty of the system wasn't just in the bondage itself, but in the casual way it shattered every human connection, every bond of love and kinship. By 11:30, the auction was winding down. That's when she was brought out. The records from that day, preserved in the South Carolina Historical Society archives, list her only as female, Negro, approximately 22 years of age, name given as Celeste. No last name, of course. Enslaved people weren't granted that dignity. Just Celeste, a young woman whose life was about to be sold to the highest bidder. But here's where the story takes its first dark turn. The moment Celeste was led onto the auction block, something changed in the room. You could feel it, according to the later testimony of a man named William Gadsden, a clerk who worked at Ryan's Mart and whose diary survived in his family's possession until it was donated to the Charleston Museum in 1923. Gadsden wrote that the crowd, which had been noisy and aggressive, competing loudly for the previous lots, suddenly went quiet, not the quiet of respect, but something else. He described it as the quiet of men who'd seen something they wanted no part of. The auctioneer, a man named Thomas Ryan, began his pitch. He started with the usual descriptions: her age, her apparent health, her ability to work. But even Ryan seemed subdued. His voice lacked the enthusiastic salesmanship he'd displayed for the earlier lots. When he opened the bidding, expecting the usual flurry of raised hands and shouted offers, he was met with silence. Not a single bid, not one. Ryan tried again, lowering the starting price. Still nothing. The men in that room, men who made their fortunes on the backs of enslaved people, men who'd just spent thousands of dollars on human beings without a second thought, refused to bid on this woman. Some turned away. Others whispered to their neighbors. A few even left the building. Nathaniel Harlow stood near the back of the room. He'd been ready to leave himself, having purchased 3 strong young men for field work. But the sight of this woman standing on the block, unbid, unwanted, stirred something in him. Perhaps it was curiosity. Perhaps it was the challenge of it, the puzzle of why no one else would touch this purchase. Or perhaps, and this is what his later writings suggest, it was the look in her eyes. Gadsden described Celeste in his diary as handsome, with features that suggested mixed heritage, skin the color of polished mahogany, and eyes that seemed to look straight through a man. But it was more than that. She wasn't looking down in submission like most of the enslaved people forced onto that block. She wasn't crying or pleading. She stood perfectly still, her gaze moving slowly across the crowd, and according to Gadsden, when her eyes met those of the potential buyers, they looked away. Harlow raised his hand. He bid $200, less than a third of what the young men had gone for, less than what a healthy woman of her age should have cost. Ryan seized on the bid immediately, as if afraid Harlow might change his mind. Going once, going twice, sold. Just like that, Celeste belonged to Nathaniel Harlow. After the sale, Harlow approached the auction house office to complete the paperwork. This was standard procedure. Bills of sale had to be drawn up, money exchanged, ownership transferred. While the clerk prepared the documents, Harlow asked Thomas Ryan a direct question. Why had no one else bid? What was wrong with her? According to Harlow's own journal, discovered in a trunk in his great-grandson's attic in 1934, Ryan became immediately uncomfortable. He shuffled the papers on his desk. He wouldn't meet Harlow's eyes. Finally, he said that there were rumors, nothing more than rumors, but that the other planters had their reasons for staying clear. Harlow pressed him. What rumors? Ryan leaned in close, and what he said made even a hardened plantation owner like Nathaniel Harlow feel a chill despite the warm March morning. She'd belonged to a man named Edmund Ravencroft, owner of a plantation called Shadowbrook, about 40 miles inland. Ravencroft was dead now, had been for 3 weeks. That's why his property was being sold off, including the people he'd enslaved. But the circumstances of his death, well, those circumstances had people talking. Edmund Ravencroft had been found in his study with his throat cut. At first, everyone assumed it was suicide. The man had been in debt, his plantation failing, his wife dead 2 years prior. Suicide made sense. But then the details emerged, details that didn't fit. The razor wasn't in the room. There were signs of a struggle. And most disturbing of all, Ravencroft's personal diary, which he'd kept meticulously for decades, had pages torn out, the last 2 weeks of entries simply gone. The investigation, such as it was, focused immediately on the enslaved people of Shadowbrook. In the antebellum South, when a white person died under suspicious circumstances, the enslaved were always the first, and often the only suspects. Every person enslaved by Ravencroft was questioned, interrogated, in some cases tortured for information, but they all told the same story. They'd been in their quarters that night. They'd heard nothing. They knew nothing except for Celeste. Celeste had been different. She'd worked in the main house, had access to Ravencroft in ways the field workers did not. And according to the other enslaved people at Shadowbrook, Ravencroft had taken a particular interest in her, the kind of interest that made everyone uncomfortable, the kind that was all too common and all too horrifying in the reality of slavery. When the investigators questioned Celeste, she said nothing, not a word. She simply stared at them with those same penetrating eyes, refusing to speak, refusing to defend herself, refusing to cooperate in any way. This silence was seen as suspicious, possibly even an admission of guilt. But here's the thing about slavery in the American South in 1859. Actually prosecuting an enslaved person for murder was complicated. It meant a trial, publicity, questions about the system itself, and in Celeste's case there was another problem. There was no evidence, none at all, no murder weapon, no witnesses, no physical proof that she'd done anything wrong. So rather than pursue a prosecution that might fail or draw unwanted attention, Ravencroft's executor decided on a different solution: sell her, send her somewhere else, make her someone else's problem. That's why she ended up on the auction block at Ryan's Mart, and that's why, when word spread among the potential buyers about where she'd come from and the circumstances surrounding her previous owner's death, not a single one wanted anything to do with her. But Nathaniel Harlow had already bought her, the papers were signed, the money had changed hands, and according to the laws of South Carolina in 1859, Celeste was now his property. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content. We're just getting started, and what happens next is even more disturbing. Harlow arranged for Celeste to be transported to Blackwater Plantation. The journey took most of the day, travelling by wagon along rutted dirt roads. Harlow rode alongside on horseback, and according to his journal, Celeste sat in the back of the wagon in complete silence. She didn't try to escape, didn't cry, didn't speak. She simply sat there, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes focused on something in the distance that only she could see. When they arrived at Blackwater, Harlow faced a decision: where to put her, what work to assign her. The overseer of the plantation, a brutal man named Silas Crawford, suggested putting her straight to work in the rice fields, the most grueling labor on the plantation. But Harlow, for reasons he didn't fully explain even in his private writings, decided against it. Instead, he assigned her to work in the main house, helping the cook, a woman named Martha who'd been at Blackwater for over 20 years. This decision disturbed Crawford greatly. According to letters Crawford wrote to his brother, preserved in the Crawford family papers at Duke University, he thought Harlow was making a terrible mistake. The woman was dangerous, possibly a murderer, and giving her access to the main house, to Harlow's private spaces, was asking for trouble. Crawford even threatened to quit if Harlow didn't change his mind. But Harlow was the owner, and his word was law. Celeste would work in the house. For the first few weeks, nothing happened. Celeste performed her duties without complaint. She still didn't speak, not a word to anyone, but she worked efficiently. Martha, the cook, reported that the girl seemed intelligent, learned tasks quickly, and kept to herself. But there was something about her that made the other enslaved people at Blackwater uneasy. They avoided her when they could. They didn't eat with her. In their quarters at night, they whispered about her, about what she might have done at Shadowbrook, about what she might do at Blackwater. Harlow, meanwhile, became increasingly curious about his newest acquisition. He was a man who prided himself on understanding the people he enslaved, on knowing how to control them, how to extract the maximum labor while maintaining order. But Celeste was an enigma. She didn't respond to threats or rewards. She showed no fear and no gratitude. She simply existed, performing her tasks with mechanical efficiency, her thoughts and feelings completely opaque. One evening, about a month after Celeste arrived at Blackwater, Harlow was working in his study when she brought him his dinner. This was Martha's job, but Martha had taken ill that day, so Celeste had been sent in her place. Harlow watched as she set the tray down on his desk, and as she turned to leave, he spoke to her directly for the first time since the auction. "Did you kill Edmund Ravencroft?" Celeste stopped. She stood there for a long moment, her back to him, perfectly still. Then she turned and looked at him with those dark, penetrating eyes, and for the first time since she'd been brought to Ryan's Mart, she spoke. Her voice was quiet but clear, with a precision to her words that suggested education, learning, things that enslaved people weren't supposed to have access to. She said, "Does it matter?" Harlow was taken aback. Does it matter? Of course it mattered. Murder was murder, regardless of the circumstances. But before he could respond, Celeste continued. She asked him if he knew what Edmund Ravencroft had done to her, the specifics of the abuse she'd endured, the violence, the degradation. She didn't go into detail, didn't need to. Both of them knew what happened to enslaved women in the privacy of plantation houses, knew it was so common that it was barely worth remarking on, a horror so normalized that the law didn't even recognize it as a crime. Then she asked him a second question. If she had killed Ravencroft, and she wasn't saying she had, but if she had, would that make her a murderer, or would that make her something else, someone defending herself? Someone striking back against a system that gave her no other recourse, no other protection, no other hope. Harlow didn't answer. He couldn't, because to answer would be to confront the fundamental evil of the system he benefited from, the system he'd participated in his entire life. Instead, he dismissed her, told her to leave, and she did, walking out of his study in that same silent, measured way, leaving him alone with questions he'd never allowed himself to ask before. That conversation marked a turning point at Blackwater, though no one understood it at the time. Over the following weeks, Harlow began to change, small things at first. He started spending more time in his study, reading, writing in his journal, things he'd always done but now with an intensity that concerned his overseer. He made odd decisions, like ordering better rations for the enslaved people at Blackwater, like forbidding Crawford from using the whip except in extreme circumstances. Crawford was baffled and increasingly resentful. But Harlow was also watching Celeste, observing her interactions with the other enslaved people at Blackwater, trying to understand what it was about her that unsettled everyone so deeply. And slowly he began to notice things. The way she moved through the house as if she owned it, not with arrogance, but with a quiet confidence that suggested she didn't see herself as property. The way she looked at him, not with the downcast eyes of submission, but with a directness that was almost confrontational. And most disturbing of all, the way things seemed to happen around her. Small things, strange things. The overseer Silas Crawford fell ill with a mysterious ailment that left him bedridden for 2 weeks. When he recovered, he was different, quieter, less brutal. A slave catcher who came to Blackwater looking for runaways left suddenly in the middle of the night, looking pale and shaken, refusing to explain what had changed his mind. Equipment broke at odd times. Animals spooked without reason, and through it all, Celeste remained calm, silent, working her duties with that same mechanical efficiency, as if none of it had anything to do with her. The other enslaved people at Blackwater began to whisper that she was a conjure woman, someone who practiced the folk magic and spiritual traditions that had survived the Middle Passage, that had been passed down in secret despite every effort to stamp them out. Conjure, or hoodoo as it was sometimes called, was a blend of African spiritual practices, Native American herbalism, and Christian elements, a form of resistance that gave enslaved people a sense of power in a world designed to render them powerless. Whether Celeste actually practiced conjure or whether the rumors were simply the result of fear and superstition is impossible to say with certainty. What we do know from multiple sources is that people believed she did. And in a world where belief shaped reality, where the enslaved had so little control over their lives that any source of power, real or imagined, became vitally important, that belief had consequences, Harlow found himself caught between two worlds. On one hand, he was a rational man, educated, a product of the Enlightenment thinking that had shaped the founding generation of America. He didn't believe in magic or spirits or curses. On the other hand, he couldn't deny what he was seeing, the changes at Blackwater, the fear that Celeste inspired, the sense that something fundamental had shifted on his plantation. He began to research Edmund Ravencroft's death more thoroughly. He wrote letters to people who'd known Ravencroft, who'd been at Shadowbrook, trying to piece together what had actually happened that night. The responses he received, preserved in his papers, painted a disturbing picture. Ravencroft had been a monster, even by the standards of his time. He'd been known for his cruelty, not just to the people he enslaved, but to everyone around him. He'd driven his wife to an early grave, had alienated his neighbors, had ruled Shadowbrook with a viciousness that made even other plantation owners uncomfortable, and Celeste hadn't been his only victim. There had been others before her, women who'd disappeared from Shadowbrook in the middle of the night, women who'd been sold away suddenly without explanation, women who, according to whispered rumors, had ended up dead. One letter, from a former neighbor of Ravencroft's, suggested that at least 3 enslaved women had died under suspicious circumstances at Shadowbrook over the years, but no investigations had been conducted. After all, they were property. Their deaths were regrettable losses of value, nothing more. Celeste had been the latest in a long line of victims, but unlike the others, she hadn't disappeared. She hadn't died. She'd survived, and if the rumors were true, she'd done more than survive. She'd struck back. Harlow found himself in an impossible position. If Celeste had killed Ravencroft, and he was becoming increasingly convinced that she had, what was he supposed to do about it? Turn her in. That would mean a trial, publicity, questions he didn't want to answer. It would mean acknowledging what Ravencroft had done, what men like Ravencroft did all across the South every day, the sexual violence that was woven into the fabric of slavery itself. It would mean confronting his own complicity in a system that made such violence possible. But more than that, Harlow found himself feeling something he'd never expected to feel about an enslaved person. Sympathy, even respect. Because if Celeste had killed Ravencroft, she'd done something that took enormous courage, enormous strength. She'd risked everything, her life, any chance at survival, to stop a man who'd brutalized her and others like her. In a world where the enslaved were supposed to be passive victims, she'd acted, she'd fought back. These thoughts terrified Harlow because they undermined everything he'd built his life on. If an enslaved person could be brave, could be noble, could be morally justified in killing their enslaver, then what did that say about the system itself? What did it say about him? Summer came to Blackwater, bringing with it the oppressive heat and humidity of the South Carolina lowcountry. The rice fields needed constant tending, and the work was brutal. But inside the main house, away from the worst of the labor, Celeste continued her quiet existence. She still rarely spoke, but when she did, her words had a weight to them that made people listen. She'd become, in a strange way, a presence at Blackwater, someone everyone was aware of even when she wasn't in the room. Harlow began to have conversations with her, brief exchanges that always left him unsettled. She never admitted to killing Ravencroft, never confirmed or denied the rumors, but she spoke about slavery itself with a clarity and insight that shocked him. She talked about what it meant to be property, to have no control over your body, your labor, your very life. She talked about the violence that permeated every aspect of the system, not just the physical violence of the whip, but the psychological violence of being told, every day, that you weren't fully human. And she asked him questions, uncomfortable questions. She asked him how he justified enslaving over 200 people. She asked him if he ever thought about what would happen when the system finally collapsed, because it would collapse. She was certain of that. She asked him what he would say to God when he died, how he would account for the suffering he'd caused. Harlow had no good answers. He tried to fall back on the usual justifications, that slavery was economically necessary, that it was sanctioned by the Bible, that the enslaved were better off under white supervision than they would be on their own. But even as he said these things, he knew they were lies, comfortable lies that white Southerners told themselves to avoid confronting the truth. Celeste didn't argue with him. She just listened, her dark eyes watching him, and somehow her silence was more damning than any argument could have been. We're about to reveal what investigators found next, but first, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss stories like this. What happens at Blackwater Plantation in the coming months will change everything, and you won't want to miss a single moment. By October of 1859, tensions at Blackwater had reached a breaking point. Silas Crawford, the overseer, had become increasingly paranoid about Celeste. He was convinced she was practicing conjure, that she'd cursed him during his illness, that she was plotting something against Harlow and the plantation. He began pressuring Harlow to sell her, to get rid of her before she caused real trouble. But Harlow refused. He'd become, in his own words, fascinated by Celeste, by the puzzle she represented. He knew this fascination was dangerous, that it was blurring the lines that were supposed to exist between enslaver and enslaved, but he couldn't help himself. For the first time in his life, he was questioning the system he'd always taken for granted, and Celeste was the catalyst for those questions. Then, on the night of October 16th, 1859, everything changed. News reached Blackwater of an event that had occurred in Harper's Ferry, Virginia. A white abolitionist named John Brown, along with a small group of followers, had attempted to seize the federal armory there, planning to arm enslaved people and spark a massive uprising. The raid had failed, Brown had been captured, but the news sent shockwaves through the South. The fear of slave rebellion was the nightmare that haunted every plantation owner, every white Southerner. It was why the slave patrols existed, why the laws were so harsh, why any hint of resistance was met with overwhelming violence, and now, with Brown's raid, that nightmare seemed closer to reality than ever. At Blackwater, the response was immediate. Crawford increased security, restricting the movement of the enslaved people, implementing a curfew, searching their quarters for weapons. The atmosphere became tense, oppressive. Everyone could feel that something was about to break. Harlow retreated into his study, reading the newspaper accounts of the Harper's Ferry raid over and over. John Brown had been motivated by a belief that slavery was a sin, a moral evil that justified violent resistance. He'd been willing to die for that belief, and soon he would, hanged for treason. Harlow found himself thinking about Brown, about the conviction that had driven him to such desperate action. And he found himself thinking about Celeste, about whether she harbored similar convictions, similar willingness to act. One evening, nearly a week after the news of Harper's Ferry reached Blackwater, Celeste brought Harlow his dinner. As she set the tray down, Harlow asked her what she thought about John Brown. Did she see him as a hero, a madman, something in between? Celeste was silent for a long moment, and when she spoke, her words were careful, measured. She said that John Brown had seen the truth, that slavery was evil and had to be destroyed, but his method, trying to spark an uprising from the outside, was doomed to fail. Real change, lasting change, would have to come from within, from the enslaved themselves finding ways to resist, to survive, to chip away at the system day by day until it finally crumbled. Then she looked at Harlow directly and said something that he would record in his journal that very night, something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. She said, "You asked me once if I killed Edmund Ravencroft. I'll tell you now, he deserved to die, not because of what he did to me, though that would have been reason enough. He deserved to die because he was the system made flesh, because every breath he took perpetuated the suffering of others. If someone had stopped him, and I'm not saying I did, but if someone had, That wouldn't be murder. That would be justice. Harlow sat there, stunned. It was the closest she'd come to a confession, though she still hadn't actually admitted to anything. But the implication was clear. She'd killed Ravencroft. She'd done it deliberately, coldly, and she felt no remorse because she believed it was right. And here's what terrified Harlow. Part of him agreed with her. Not the civilized, educated part that had been raised in a world where law and order were sacred, but some deeper part, some part that recognized that a system built on violence and oppression had no moral authority, no right to demand justice for those who benefited from it when they fell victim to the very violence they'd inflicted on others. That night, Harlow made a decision. He couldn't keep Celeste at Blackwater, not because he feared she might kill him, though that thought had crossed his mind, but because her presence was changing him, forcing him to confront truths he wasn't ready to face. He decided to sell her, to send her somewhere far away where she'd be someone else's problem, someone else's conscience. But when he told Celeste of his decision the next morning, her reaction surprised him. She didn't beg or plead. She simply asked him one question. What would happen to her? Where would she end up? Harlow admitted he didn't know. Probably another plantation, possibly somewhere deeper in the south, possibly somewhere worse than Blackwater. The slave trade was unpredictable, brutal. He couldn't guarantee her safety or even her survival. Celeste nodded slowly, as if she'd expected this answer. Then she told Harlow something that made his blood run cold. She said that if he sold her, she would kill her next owner, not might would, because she was done being property, done being passed from one enslaver to another, done with a system that saw her as less than human. She'd killed once, and she could kill again, and again, and again, until either the system ended or she did. It wasn't a threat, not exactly. It was a statement of fact, delivered in that same calm, quiet voice she always used. But the certainty in her words, the absolute conviction, made Harlow believe her completely. He was trapped. If he sold her, he'd be sending her to her death or sending her new owner to his. If he kept her, he'd be harboring someone he now knew was dangerous, someone who'd admitted to murder and promised to kill again. And if he freed her, which wasn't even legal in South Carolina without special permission from the state legislature, he'd be opening himself up to legal troubles and social ostracism. For days, Harlow agonized over what to do. He could turn her in, could reveal what she'd told him, and let the law deal with her. But that would mean a trial, a spectacle, and almost certainly her execution. Despite everything, despite the danger she represented, he found he couldn't do it. Something in him, some part that had been awakened by their conversations, rebelled at the thought of being responsible for her death. In mid-November, John Brown was executed in Virginia. The news spread across the South like wildfire, with white Southerners celebrating the death of a man they saw as a terrorist and abolitionists mourning the loss of a martyr. At Blackwater, the enslaved people were silent, but Harlow could sense the tension, the barely suppressed rage that simmered beneath the surface. The night after Brown's execution, something happened that would become the subject of rumors and speculation for decades to come. Harlow was awakened in the middle of the night by sounds from downstairs. He grabbed a pistol he kept by his bedside and crept down to investigate. What he found would be recorded in his journal, though he'd never speak of it publicly. In his study, by the light of a single candle, sat Celeste. She was reading one of his books, a volume of philosophy by Voltaire. She looked up when he entered, completely unafraid of the gun in his hand, and asked him if he'd ever read Voltaire's views on slavery, how he'd called it an atrocity that would condemn any society that practiced it. Harlow demanded to know what she was doing in his study in the middle of the night. How had she gotten in? The door was locked. She ignored his questions and instead asked him if he'd made a decision about her fate. Was he going to sell her, turn her in, keep her at Blackwater? When Harlow didn't answer, Celeste stood and walked toward him. She stopped a few feet away, close enough that he could have reached out and grabbed her, close enough that the gun in his hand could have ended her life in an instant. But he didn't move. He couldn't. He was paralyzed by her gaze, by the intelligence and defiance he saw there. She told him that she knew he was struggling with his conscience, that he was beginning to see the truth about slavery, about the evil he'd participated in his whole life. She told him that she didn't hate him personally, that he wasn't the worst of his kind, but that didn't absolve him of responsibility. He'd benefited from the suffering of others. He'd owned human beings. That stain would never wash away, no matter what he did now. Then she told him something that would change his life. She said that she was leaving Blackwater, not because he was selling her or freeing her, but because she was taking her freedom herself. She'd been planning this for weeks, gathering supplies, making contacts, preparing for the dangerous journey north. She was going to run, and she was telling him this directly, to his face, giving him the chance to stop her. But she didn't think he would, because despite everything, despite his upbringing and his economic interests and the society he lived in, he was beginning to understand. He was beginning to see that slavery wasn't just wrong, it was an abomination, and that people like her, people who resisted, who fought back, who refused to accept their bondage, were more moral than the people who enslaved them could ever be. Harlow stood there, gun in hand, facing a woman who just admitted to murder and announced her intention to escape. By every law of South Carolina, by every expectation of his society, he should have stopped her. Should have called for the overseer, should have had her locked up, should have done something to prevent her escape. But he didn't. He lowered the gun and stepped aside, and Celeste walked past him, out of his study, out of his house, and into the night. He never saw her again. The next morning, when her absence was discovered, Harlow reported her as a runaway. He offered a reward for her capture, posted notices, did everything he was expected to do. But the search was half-hearted, the pursuit cursory. Crawford, the overseer, suspected something was wrong, that Harlow wasn't really trying to find her, but he had no proof. In the weeks that followed, Harlow's behavior became increasingly erratic. He spent long hours in his study, writing in his journal, filling page after page with his thoughts about slavery, about morality, about the society he lived in. He began to make changes at Blackwater, small at first, but gradually more significant. He improved conditions for the people he enslaved, gave them more autonomy, stopped some of the worst abuses. It wasn't freedom, not even close, but it was something. And then, in December of 1860, South Carolina seceded from the Union. 4 months later, Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, and the Civil War began. Blackwater Plantation, like so much of the South, was swept up in the conflict. Many of the enslaved people at Blackwater escaped during the chaos of war, fleeing to Union lines where they'd be free. Others stayed, trapped by circumstance or uncertainty about what freedom would actually mean. Harlow himself joined the Confederate Army, though his journals suggest his heart wasn't in it. He served as a staff officer, never seeing combat, spending most of his time on administrative duties, but the war changed him profoundly. Seeing the destruction, the death, the waste of it all, seemed to confirm what Celeste had told him, that the system was doomed, that it deserved to be doomed. He survived the war, returning to Blackwater in 1865 to find his plantation in ruins. The main house had been burned, most of the enslaved people gone, his fortune destroyed. But he also returned to a South where slavery had been abolished, where the people he'd once owned were now, legally at least, free. In his later journals, Harlow wrote extensively about Celeste. He wondered if she'd made it to freedom, if she'd survived the dangerous journey north. He hoped she had, though he knew the odds were against her. Thousands of people attempted to escape slavery every year, and many were caught and returned, punished brutally for their audacity. but he never heard anything definite about her fate. She simply vanished into history, one of millions of enslaved people whose full stories we'll never know, whose lives were lived in the shadows, recorded only in fragments and glimpses. What we do know is that there's no record of Celeste ever being captured. The reward Harlow offered was never claimed, and in the decades after the Civil War, there were occasional rumors in the black communities of South Carolina about a woman who'd escaped slavery before the war, who'd made it north, who'd lived to see freedom. But there's more to this story, much more, because in 1867 something extraordinary happened that suggests Celeste not only survived but thrived in ways that no one could have predicted. A letter arrived at what remained of Blackwater Plantation, addressed to Nathaniel Harlow. It had been sent from Philadelphia, though there was no return address, and when Harlow opened it, he found a single page written in elegant handwriting that he immediately recognized as Celeste's. The letter, which survived in Harlow's papers and is now preserved in the South Carolina Historical Society, is remarkable for several reasons. First, it confirmed that Celeste had successfully escaped, had made it to Philadelphia, and was living as a free woman. But more than that, it revealed details about her background that explained so much about who she was and why she'd been so different from other enslaved people. Celeste wrote that she'd been born free in Louisiana, the daughter of a free woman of color and a French merchant. She'd been educated, had learned to read and write, had grown up in relative comfort in New Orleans. But when her mother died and her father returned to France, leaving her alone, she'd been kidnapped by slave catchers who saw an opportunity in a young woman with no family and no proof of her free status. She'd been sold into slavery at the age of 17, her papers destroyed, her identity erased, everything she'd been, everything she'd worked for, stolen in an instant. For 5 years she'd been enslaved, passed from owner to owner, ending up finally at Edmund Ravencroft's Shadowbrook plantation. And yes, she confirmed in the letter, she had killed Ravencroft. She'd planned it carefully, waiting for the right moment, using her knowledge of herbs and poisons that she'd learned from her mother to weaken him first, then finishing the job with his own razor while he lay helpless. She'd staged it to look like suicide, had destroyed evidence, had played the perfect part of the ignorant enslaved woman while the investigation swirled around her. She'd been sold to Harlow not because the other buyers suspected her specifically, but because everyone at that auction knew something terrible had happened at Shadowbrook, and they didn't want any part of whatever curse or bad luck might be attached to anyone who'd lived there. Superstition, not evidence, had kept them from bidding, and that superstition had saved her life because it meant no one looked too closely, no one investigated too thoroughly. In the letter, Celeste told Harlow that she didn't regret killing Ravencroft, not for a single moment. He'd brutalized her and others, had destroyed lives with casual cruelty, had been a monster who hid behind the legal protections that slavery provided to white men. In killing him, she'd done what the law refused to do, what society refused to acknowledge even needed to be done. She delivered justice where none existed, but she also thanked Harlow, thanked him for not stopping her that night when she told him she was leaving, thanked him for the half-hearted search that followed. She said she'd watched him during the month she'd been at Blackwater, had seen him beginning to question the system he'd been raised in, had recognized something in him that gave her hope. Not that he was good, she was careful to note, but that he was capable of change, capable of seeing the truth when it was placed directly in front of him. She ended the letter with a warning and a prophecy. The warning was this: if he ever told anyone what she'd told him, if he ever revealed her location or her identity, she would find out. She had friends now, connections in the abolitionist movement, people who would help her if she needed it. And she wouldn't hesitate to protect herself by any means necessary. She'd killed once and would kill again if her freedom was threatened. The prophecy was more subtle, but just as chilling. She wrote that slavery was dying, that the war had sealed its fate, but that the end of slavery wouldn't mean the end of racism or oppression. White America would find new ways to subjugate black Americans, new systems of control that didn't call themselves slavery but served the same purpose. She wrote that the fight for true freedom, for true equality, would take generations, would require sacrifice and blood and courage that most people couldn't imagine. And she wrote that people like her, people who'd suffered under slavery and survived, people who'd fought back and won their freedom, would be at the forefront of that fight. They would never forget what had been done to them, would never forgive the system that had tried to break them. They would build something new, something better, or die trying. Harlow kept that letter hidden for the rest of his life. He never showed it to anyone, never spoke of it, never used the information it contained. And when he died in 1889, the letter was discovered among his private papers by his son, who was horrified by what he read. The son considered burning it, destroying this evidence of his father's complicity in a murder and an escape. But something stopped him. Perhaps it was the same thing that had stopped Nathaniel Harlow that night in 1859. Perhaps it was the recognition that some stories need to be preserved, even when they are uncomfortable, even when they challenge everything we think we know. But the story doesn't end with that letter, because in 1934, a historian researching the abolitionist movement in Philadelphia made a discovery. In the archives of the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society, he found records of a woman named Celeste Laurent, who'd arrived in Philadelphia in late 1859. According to these records, Laurent had claimed to be a free woman of color from Louisiana who'd been kidnapped and sold into slavery. She'd sought help from the Abolition Society to establish her freedom legally and to begin rebuilding her life. The records show that Celeste Laurent became active in the abolitionist movement, working with the Underground Railroad to help other escaped slaves reach freedom. She was described in letters and documents as intelligent, fearless, and intensely private. She never married, never had children that anyone knew of, devoted her entire life to the cause of freedom. During the Civil War, Laurent worked as a nurse for the United States colored troops, caring for black soldiers who fought for the Union. After the war, she became involved in the fight for civil rights during Reconstruction, working to establish schools for freed slaves, advocating for voting rights, challenging the new systems of oppression that were emerging just as she'd predicted in her letter to Harlow. She lived until 1903, dying at the age of 66 in Philadelphia. Her obituary in the black newspaper, The Christian Recorder, described her as a tireless fighter for justice, a woman who'd overcome tremendous adversity, a pillar of the community. But it made no mention of her years in slavery, no mention of Shadowbrook or Blackwater or Edmund Ravencroft. Those details had been buried, hidden away, protected. It wasn't until the 1930s, when both Harlow's papers and the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society records became available to researchers, that historians began to piece together the connection. The handwriting in Celeste Laurent's letters to the Abolition Society matched the handwriting in the letter to Harlow. The timeline fit perfectly, the details aligned. Celeste, the woman who'd been sold at auction for $200 because no one else would bid on her, the woman suspected of murder, the woman who'd terrified experienced slaveholders with nothing but her presence and her silence, had not only survived, but had become a significant figure in one of the most important social movements in American history. But here's where the story takes another dark turn, because we need to return to Edmund Ravencroft and Shadowbrook Plantation. Remember, Ravencroft's death was never officially solved. The case remained open, though no one really pursued it after Celeste was sold away. But in 1923, during renovations at Shadowbrook, which had changed hands several times since Ravencroft's death, workers made a grisly discovery. Behind a false wall in Ravencroft's study, they found a small room that hadn't appeared in any of the plantation's architectural plans. Inside that room were the remains of 3 bodies, 3 women, in various states of decomposition. All 3 showed signs of violence. All 3 had been there for years, possibly decades, and based on the location and the circumstances, investigators concluded that Ravencroft had been responsible for their deaths. The discovery confirmed what the whispered rumors had always suggested, that Ravencroft had been murdering enslaved women and hiding their bodies. It also provided a much fuller picture of what Celeste had been facing at Shadowbrook, the danger she'd been in, the monster she'd been dealing with. When she killed Ravencroft, she wasn't just defending herself, she was stopping a serial killer, someone who would have continued murdering until someone stopped him. This discovery, 70 years after the fact, cast Celeste's actions in a completely different light. Not that it mattered legally, she was long dead by then, but it mattered historically. It suggested that far from being a cold-blooded murderer, Celeste had been acting in self-defense, and in defense of others who couldn't protect themselves. She'd done what law enforcement wouldn't do, what society refused to do, because the victims were black and enslaved and therefore considered disposable. But there's one more piece to this puzzle, one more revelation that brings everything full circle. In Nathaniel Harlowe's journal, in entries written in the final years of his life, he reflected on his encounter with Celeste and what it had meant to him. He wrote that meeting her had destroyed his faith in the society he'd been raised in, had shown him that the people he'd been taught to see as property were actually human beings with their own agency, their own moral reasoning, their own capacity for resistance. He wrote that he'd spent the rest of his life trying to atone for the evil he'd participated in, though he knew atonement was impossible. You couldn't atone for owning other human beings, for benefiting from their suffering, for participating in a system of such profound cruelty. All you could do was acknowledge the truth, bear witness to what had happened, and try to build something better for the future. In one particularly haunting passage, Harlowe wrote about a dream he'd had shortly before his death. In the dream, he was back at Ryan's Mart on that March day in 1859, watching Celeste stand on the auction block. But this time, when no one else bid on her, Harlowe didn't raise his hand. He let the auction pass, let her be sold to someone else, or sent back to whatever fate awaited unsold slaves. And in the dream, he watched as she was led away, her eyes meeting his one last time, full of judgment and knowledge and something that looked like pity. He woke from that dream, he wrote, certain that not buying her would have been the greater evil. Because if he hadn't bought her, if she'd ended up somewhere else, she might never have escaped. She might have died in slavery, another nameless victim of a brutal system. His moment of curiosity, his willingness to buy what no one else wanted, had inadvertently given her the opportunity she needed to reach freedom. But he also knew that this didn't absolve him of anything. He'd still been a slaveholder. He'd still owned people, including Celeste, even if only briefly. His help, such as it was, had been passive, a decision not to act rather than a decision to actively assist. He'd let her go, but he'd never truly fought against slavery until it was too late, until the system had already destroyed itself through war. The question that haunted Harlowe until his death, the question he asked over and over in his journal, was this: how many others like Celeste had there been? How many people with her intelligence, her strength, her capacity for resistance, had been crushed by slavery before they could escape? How many potential leaders, thinkers, artists, revolutionaries had been lost to a system that saw them only as labor, as property, as less than human? We'll never know the answer to that question. The full cost of slavery, the loss of human potential, the suffering inflicted over centuries, is incalculable. Celeste's story survived only because of a peculiar set of circumstances, because Harlow kept his journal, because documents were preserved, because researchers decades later made connections. But for every story like hers that survived, there are thousands, millions that didn't. And that's the real horror at the heart of this story. Not just what happened to Celeste, not just what she was forced to do to survive, but the fact that she was one of millions who suffered under slavery, one of millions who resisted in whatever ways they could, one of millions whose full humanity was denied, whose stories were erased, whose names were forgotten. The physical evidence of slavery still exists. The auction houses like Ryan's Mart, the plantations like Blackwater and Shadowbrook, the documents, the bills of sale, the ledgers that recorded human beings as property. But the lived experience of slavery, the day-to-day reality of being enslaved, the psychological and emotional toll, the individual stories of resistance and survival, most of that has been lost to history. Celeste's story gives us a glimpse into that lost world. It shows us what slavery really meant, not in abstract terms or economic statistics, but in human terms. The violence, the sexual abuse, the psychological warfare, the constant threat of death or separation from loved ones. It shows us what resistance looked like, not grand rebellions or dramatic escapes, though those happened too, but quiet acts of defiance, moments of courage, decisions to survive by any means necessary. And it shows us something else, something that made people at the time deeply uncomfortable, and still makes people uncomfortable today. It shows us that the enslaved were fully human, with the same capacity for moral reasoning, the same ability to judge right from wrong, the same right to defend themselves that anyone else has. When we acknowledge that, when we really grapple with what it means, it becomes impossible to defend slavery even in historical terms, impossible to minimize its horrors, impossible to claim it was anything other than a moral atrocity. The reason no one bid on Celeste at that auction, the reason experienced slaveholders avoided her, wasn't really because they suspected her of murder. It was because, on some level, they recognized something in her that terrified them. They recognized that she saw through the lies slavery was built on, that she refused to accept her bondage, that she was dangerous not because she was violent, but because she was free in her mind, even when her body was in chains. That's what slavery could never quite destroy, no matter how brutal it became. The human spirit, the capacity for resistance, the refusal to be broken. Celeste embodied that refusal. She'd been kidnapped, enslaved, abused, dehumanized, and she'd emerged from it all with her sense of self intact, with her dignity preserved, with her determination to be free unshaken. She'd killed to protect that freedom, and while we might be uncomfortable acknowledging it, while it might challenge our ideas about morality and justice, there's a case to be made that she was right to do so. Edmund Ravencroft was a monster who was never going to face justice through legal means. The system protected him, enabled him, gave him the power to brutalize enslaved women with impunity. In killing him, Celeste didn't just save herself, she saved whoever would have been his next victim, and the one after that, and the one after that. This is the uncomfortable truth at the heart of this story. Sometimes, in systems of profound injustice, the only way to achieve justice is through means that the system itself would call criminal. Sometimes, the law is not on the side of the righteous. Sometimes, acts that would be murder in one context are self-defense in another. And sometimes, history remembers people as heroes for doing things that were technically illegal but morally necessary. Celeste never sought recognition for what she'd done. She never wrote a memoir, never gave interviews, never tried to claim the fame that other abolitionists achieved. She simply lived her life, helped others find freedom, fought for justice in whatever ways she could. She kept her secrets, protected her past, and focused on building a future where no one would have to do what she'd done, where slavery would be a nightmare relegated to history books rather than a living reality. In that, she was remarkably successful. She lived to see slavery abolished, lived to see the 13th Amendment ratified, lived to see black men gain the right to vote during Reconstruction. She also lived to see the promise of Reconstruction betrayed, lived to see new systems of oppression emerge in the form of Jim Crow laws, lived to see the terrorism of groups like the Ku Klux Klan, lived to see white America find new ways to deny black Americans their fundamental rights. In her later letters, preserved in various abolitionist archives, Celeste wrote about her frustration with how slowly progress came, how resistant white America was to true equality, how the promises made to freed slaves were broken almost as soon as they were made. But she never gave up hope. She continued fighting, continued organizing, continued believing that change was possible even when it seemed impossibly distant. When she died in 1903, she was buried in Eden Cemetery in Philadelphia, one of the oldest African American cemeteries in the United States. Her gravestone is simple, giving only her name, her years of birth and death, and a single line: "She lived free." No mention of her years in slavery, no mention of her work with the abolition movement, no mention of everything she'd overcome. Just that simple statement, "She lived free," it's a powerful epitaph because it acknowledges both the struggle and the victory. She lived free not just in the legal sense after she escaped, but in the deeper sense of never allowing slavery to destroy her spirit, her sense of self, her humanity. She lived free even when she was in chains, even when the law said she was property, even when society said she was less than human. She lived free because freedom was something she claimed for herself, something no one could give her or take away. And that, ultimately, is what made her so dangerous to the system of slavery. Not that she killed Edmund Ravencroft, though that act was certainly significant, but that she embodied a truth that slavery tried desperately to suppress, that the enslaved were fully human, fully capable, fully entitled to their freedom regardless of what the law said. Every moment she lived was a repudiation of slavery's fundamental premise. Every breath she took was an act of resistance. Now, let's return to Nathaniel Harlow one final time, because his story doesn't end with the Civil War or even with his death in 1889. In 1934, when his great-grandson donated his papers to the South Carolina Historical Society, those documents became available to researchers for the first time, and what they revealed shocked the historians who studied them. Harlow had not only kept detailed journals about his encounter with Celeste, he'd also kept extensive records about Blackwater Plantation, including lists of the people he'd enslaved. After the war, after emancipation, he'd done something almost unheard of among former slaveholders. He'd tracked down as many of the people he'd formerly enslaved as he could find and had given them deeds to portions of Blackwater's land. It wasn't all the land, and it wasn't enough to truly compensate them for their years of forced labor. But it was something, a recognition of debt, an attempt at restitution. Many of the black families who farmed in that region of South Carolina in the late 19th and early 20th centuries traced their land ownership back to these deeds from Nathaniel Harlow. In letters, Harlow wrote to some of these formerly enslaved people, letters that survived in their families' collections. He acknowledged what he'd done, the evil he'd participated in. He didn't ask for forgiveness because he knew it wasn't his to ask for. He simply tried, in his limited way, to do something that approached justice. One letter in particular stands out. Written in 1887 to a man named Samuel, who'd been enslaved at Blackwater, Harlow wrote, "I cannot undo the years I stole from you. I cannot restore the family members who were sold away before I ended that practice. I cannot give you back your youth or your labor or the dignity that should have always been yours. All I can do is acknowledge the truth that you were never my property, that slavery was theft on a massive scale, that every day I participated in it was a day I lived as a thief and a tyrant. The land I'm giving you isn't payment. Payment would require more than I have. It's simply a small return of what was stolen, a tiny fraction of what is owed. These letters, these land deeds, suggest that Harlow's encounter with Celeste had a profound and lasting impact. She'd forced him to see the humanity of the people he'd enslaved, and once he'd seen it, he couldn't unsee it. He spent the rest of his life trying to make amends, knowing full well that true amends were impossible, that nothing he did could balance the scales or erase the past. But he tried anyway, and in trying, he left behind a record that helps us understand this story more fully. He left behind evidence not just of Celeste's courage and survival, but of the possibility of change, however limited, however insufficient. He showed that even people deeply embedded in systems of oppression can sometimes recognize those systems for what they are and can sometimes take steps, however small, toward justice. It's important not to romanticize this. Harlow's actions after the war don't make him a hero. They don't erase his decades as a slaveholder. They don't compensate for the suffering he caused or enabled. But they do complicate the story in important ways. They remind us that people are capable of change, that recognizing evil is possible even for those who benefit from it, and that taking responsibility, however imperfectly, is better than denying the truth. And they remind us that Celeste's impact extended beyond her own survival. She didn't just save herself when she escaped Blackwater. She also planted seeds of doubt and reflection in Harlow's mind, seeds that eventually grew into a very different understanding of slavery and his place in it. How many other people did she impact in similar ways? How many other slaveholders, overseers, slave catchers did she force to confront uncomfortable truths? We'll never know the full extent of her influence, but the evidence suggests it was significant. There's one more document that needs to be mentioned, a document discovered only recently that adds yet another layer to this already complex story. In 2003, researchers at the Library Company of Philadelphia were cataloging a collection of papers from a free black community that had existed in the city during the 19th century. Among these papers, they found a memoir written by a woman named Sarah Mitchell, who'd been active in the Underground Railroad and the abolition movement. In her memoir, Mitchell wrote about a woman she'd known in Philadelphia, a woman she called Sister Celeste. Mitchell described this woman as someone who'd suffered greatly under slavery, who'd fought her way to freedom, and who'd become a mentor to younger women in the abolition movement. And Mitchell wrote about something that Sister Celeste had told her, a piece of advice that she'd carried with her throughout her own life as an activist. Sister Celeste had said, "People will tell you that fighting slavery means big gestures, dramatic moments, grand acts of heroism, and sometimes it does. But most of the time, fighting slavery means small acts of resistance, moments of refusal, decisions to survive when survival seems impossible. It means teaching each other to read when reading is forbidden. It means keeping families together when the system tries to tear them apart. It means remembering your own humanity when everything around you denies it. And sometimes, when all other options are exhausted, it means doing things that will haunt you forever, but that need to be done anyway." This advice, this philosophy of resistance, shaped Mitchell's work and the work of countless others in the abolition movement. It emphasized both the importance of survival and the willingness to act when action was necessary. It acknowledged the moral complexity of fighting against an immoral system, and it came from lived experience, from someone who'd navigated the horrors of slavery and emerged not just alive, but determined to help others do the same. Reading that passage, knowing what we know about Celeste's story, the full weight of her words becomes clear. She wasn't speaking theoretically. She was speaking from experience, from having made the decision to kill Edmund Ravencroft, from having lived with that decision and its consequences. She was telling younger activists that resistance sometimes requires you to do things that society will condemn, things that you'll struggle with yourself, but things that are necessary nonetheless. And she was teaching them how to live with those decisions, how to carry that weight while still moving forward, still fighting, still believing in the possibility of a better world, because that's what she'd done. She'd killed a man, escaped slavery, built a new life, and used that life to help others. She'd refused to be crushed by guilt or regret or trauma, had instead channeled everything she'd experienced into action, into resistance, into the long struggle for freedom and equality. That's the legacy Celeste left behind. Not just her own survival, but her impact on others, her mentorship, her willingness to share her story in private, even while keeping it hidden from the wider world. She understood that her individual story mattered less than the broader struggle, that what she'd experienced was just one example of what millions of others had experienced, and that the only way to honor those millions was to keep fighting until slavery and all its after-effects were finally destroyed. Of course, that fight continues even today, more than 150 years after slavery was abolished. The systems of oppression that Celeste predicted would emerge after slavery, the Jim Crow laws, the mass incarceration, the economic inequality, the persistent racism, all of it came to pass just as she warned it would. The formal end of slavery in 1865 marked a critical turning point, but it didn't mark the end of the struggle. That struggle continues generation after generation, building on the work of people like Celeste, who refused to accept injustice even when doing so put their lives at risk. So what do we take away from this story? What does it mean for us today, looking back across more than 160 years at events that shaped American history in ways we're still grappling with? First, it reminds us that slavery was not an abstract historical phenomenon, but a lived reality for millions of human beings. Each of those millions had a story, had hopes and fears and dreams and traumas. Most of those stories have been lost, but the ones that survive, like Celeste's, give us a window into that past that's essential for understanding both history and our present moment. Second, it challenges us to think about justice and morality in complex ways. Was Celeste a murderer, or was she someone acting in legitimate self-defense against a system that offered no other recourse? The answer depends on whether we accept the legal framework of 1850 South Carolina, which said that enslaved people had no right to defend themselves, or whether we apply a more universal standard of human rights that says everyone has the right to protect their life and dignity. Third, it shows us that resistance takes many forms. Celeste's resistance was dramatic, violent, risky, but she also resisted through survival, through maintaining her sense of self, through helping others after she gained her freedom. Both forms of resistance mattered, both were necessary, and recognizing that helps us understand the full scope of how enslaved people fought against the system that tried to break them. Fourth, it reminds us that individuals embedded in oppressive systems can change, can recognize the evil they are participating in, and can take steps, however imperfect, toward justice. Nathaniel Harlow's transformation doesn't make him a hero, but it does show that awareness and change are possible, and that those who benefit from unjust systems have a responsibility to acknowledge that fact and work toward repair. And finally, it reminds us that history isn't really past. The events of 1859, the auction at Ryan's Mart, Celeste's escape, Harlow's crisis of conscience, all of it has echoes that reverberate into our present. The wealth generated by slavery still shapes economic inequality today. The racial hierarchies that slavery created still influence social relations. The trauma of slavery still